InvestaFest 2022 is brought to you by these major partners: Atram, To Trade Asia, and these other partners. Do not forget to share your experience and learning on social media. Use our official hashtag InvestaFest 2022.
David Leechiu is the CEO of Leechiu Property Consultants, or LPC. David has 26 years of experience in real estate and is considered the Philippines' leading commercial real estate broker. He has arranged the lease of more than 1 million square meters of office space and sold more than $2 billion worth in real estate. His career milestone spans more than 2 decades, having co-founded Leechiu Associates, or LNA, in 2003. He elevated the firm's status as country's top real estate brokerage. In 2008, LNA merged with a Fortune 500 real estate company where David led its growth to exceed the combined revenues of their competitors, serving as the country manager and the only Filipino International Director until 2015. He is co-founder and shareholder of the W Group, known in the industry for its world-class office buildings in Bonifacio Global City. As current Board of Trustee of the IT and Business Process Association of the Philippines, or IBPAP, David has been instrumental in the creation of the Digital Cities 2025 program. It's a joint effort with the IBPAP in the Department of Information and Communications Technology, or DICT. This initiative continues the legacy of Next Wave Cities, which aims to drive inclusive growth in the countryside by selecting high-potential areas throughout the country and transforming them into bustling IT and business process management hubs until 2025. David graduated from the University of Asia and the Pacific with a major in entrepreneurial management in 1994.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for having me over to speak to you about the property market. I do have quite a bit of slides, and it's pretty much geared towards an overview, big picture about the property market in the Philippines. And I'll give you a snapshot of all the way back to 20 years from ago, and even talk about stuff as early as 1960s. So, without further ado, let me just go and jump into these slides. Next. We have been in the best economic conditions that we've ever been in the Philippines during this administration. And as ridiculous as some of that might sound to you, I do assure you that this administration has done so much for the Philippines. It has benefited so much of the Philippines. And that's why we have to thank this administration with the person of President Duterte, and most especially to Secretary of Finance, Secretary Carlos Dominguez III, and also to Director General Charito Plaza of PEZA, because these three led the economic team that brought the Philippines to where it is today. And yes, COVID has become very difficult for the Philippines, very, very difficult. And now with the beginnings of the Russian-Ukraine crisis, things are going to be even more difficult for many people all around the world, not just for the Philippines. But I want to assure you that the Philippines is in much better place. And that's why the crisis, these two crises, the COVID crisis and the Ukraine crisis, is not hitting the Philippines as hard as it should have been because of the fantastic fiscal health of this country. Okay? And I will walk you through that very soon. What I do want to say is that because of primarily these three people and the economic team and the policies that they've made, has resulted in a continued rise in office demand in 2021 versus 2020. And that's despite COVID, despite lockdowns. Office tenants continue to expand in the Philippines, primarily led by the BPO sector. So the BPO sector is so important. Number two, the private sector debt has been very low and manageable, and that's why capital values continue to rise. What do I mean by capital values? Meaning the price of property when you want to buy. So that's called capital values, which is different from rental values, the prices of property when you want to rent. So capital values remain strong because there are very few distressed sellers and very few motivated sellers. A lot of people want to buy at big discounts and sellers refuse to sell at those discounts. In fact, all across most of the Philippines, property prices continue to climb, anywhere between 2% to 10% a year, even through crisis, even through this global COVID crisis. And what I tell investors is use this COVID crisis and Ukraine crisis as a means to buy real estate, because real estate is slowing, the appreciation of real estate has slowed down because of COVID, has slowed down because of this Ukraine crisis. And it has slowed down as a testament to the health of this economy. If the economy was in really, really bad shape, people would sell their properties cheaper at big discounts, at distress levels. That is not happening yet. It most likely will not happen in the short term, depending on how big this Ukraine crisis balloons to. But if it is status quo, and if the West and the world is able to contain the Russian-Ukraine crisis, then I think the property market will keep rising. And since 2020 began, the last two years and 1 quarter have been some of the slowest appreciating quarters of the last 22 years. Okay? So those of you who are looking to buy, I would say please use this crisis, because this crisis, you're able to buy properties cheap, not cheaper, but cheap, because they could have been accelerating and appreciating faster if not for this crisis. Which leads me to the residential sector. All across Metro Manila, all across the Philippines, residential property prices continue to rise for properties in the middle and up to the upper end. The lower middle and below have been decimated by COVID, because these are the people who lost their jobs, lost their bonuses, had pay cuts, have been retrenched, or had companies that or had no work, no pay platforms, and therefore the lower middle and below were hit very hard. This is where you see a lot of foreclosures, a lot of people not able to pay rent, a lot of people who gave up their cars, who are not able to pay tuition fees, etc. But the middle and above continue to acquire property, continue to hold, and that's why in some cases, in the most extreme, Batangas Bay has become the wealthy vacation destination of the wealthy in the Philippines, and because of that, prices there have gone up anywhere from 150 to 300%. In places like Ayala, Alabang, what I think is the best place to live in, property prices there are up 60% through the COVID crisis, and so on and so forth. Now, this would not be possible if not for one driver. Then that driver is the overseas remittances. The overseas remittances bring in $30 to $35 billion a year into this economy, and it is the highest it's ever been in 2021 despite the crisis. And prior to that, the highest record was 2020 despite the COVID crisis. Overseas Filipinos continue to send more money to the Philippines as we went through a crisis. And this insulated the lifestyle and living conditions of millions and millions of Filipinos. Next. I give you the last 20 years, and this is different economic indicators of the Philippines, from the stock market, GDP per capita, tourism arrivals, BPO employment and revenues, overseas remittances, and the cement consumption. Cement consumption is important because you track the amount of cement needed to build buildings, to build infrastructure, to build power plants, etc., etc. And you can see for the last 20 years, all this has been going up. And the text that you see in the upper half of that slide shows you the amount of crisis that we've been through in the country, both self-inflicted, calamity-driven, or external. Whether it's the Euro debt crisis, the Argentine crisis, the global financial crisis, the tech bubble, the I don't know what other crises are out there, SARS, the H1N1 crisis, etc. And the amount of coup d'etats, the amount of attempts to remove a president, a sitting president between Arab and GMA, and etc., etc. All these problems and crises that the Philippines has been through did not stop the economy from growing. This is an important piece in history because these last 21 years are some of the longest booms a country in the world has ever been through in history. Okay, 20 years unbroken boom. And that's despite of all the problems we've had as a country. And why is this possible? Three things. First, like I mentioned to you, the remittances continue to cushion us. Number two, BPO employment. And number three, reform, economic reform done by the president, starting from President Estrada through the administration of President Arroyo, through the administration of President Noy Aquino, and yes, even in the administration of President Duterte. And I would like to say even more so during the Duterte administration. And I say this with no political color. These are just facts. And we just have to appreciate that at a time when we are going through elections and a lot of the moves that are done by this administration are being politicized. Okay, next. Because of this, we have built 53 townships all over Metro Manila, and we have consumed all of them. What used to be just idle industrial residential property have now become home to many malls and office towers and residential towers, uplifting the lives of millions of people. But, next slide, I say that it is no longer about Metro Manila anymore. There are 130, possibly 150 now, townships being done all over the Philippines in what used to be very remote places are now sprinkled with so many townships. This shows you all the townships that we are aware of. There's probably 10 or 15 that need to be added here because of the launches in the last 2-3 months. Each triangle shows you a number of townships in each of these provinces. And the best example I can give you is Iloilo. I've been visiting Iloilo for 20 years, and my God, it is the most transformed location in the country outside of BGC, outside of Bonifacio Global City. And it's not just happening in Iloilo, although the most and best is happening in Iloilo. It is happening also in Palawan, in Lawag City, in Cebu, in Leyte, in Bohol, in Puerto Princesa, in Zamboanga, in General Santos, in Davao. Property values all over the Philippines have been climbing meaningfully over the last 20 years, and despite this last 2 years COVID crisis. Next. How is all this possible? I did mention to you about reform done by the past administrations, and here's a list of the ones that are meaningfully done by this administration, starting with the improved credit rating. The Philippines is one of the few countries in the world that got a credit rating upgrade in 2020, and one of the few countries in the world that maintained their credit rating. And why is a credit rating important? Because that influences foreign capital entering into the Philippines. The better the credit rating, the more capital comes into the Philippines. The better the credit rating, the lower the interest rates, and most importantly, long-term interest rates that allow you and me to borrow money at much, much lower cost. And interest rates is the biggest factor for wealth determination. The lower the interest rate in a country, the more wealth generated across a much wider population. Tax reform. Nobody remembers tax reform. Everyone takes this for granted. But prior to the tax reform in this administration, everyone earning 50,000 pesos a month, or sorry, not 50,000 pesos a month, 35,000 pesos a month, or 500,000 pesos a year was paying 32% tax. Now, that person earning 500,000 pesos a year is only paying 18%. People who are earning 20,000 pesos a month, 18,000 pesos a month are paying 15-20% tax. Now they don't even pay a single peso of tax, income tax at least. And corporate income tax is moving from 30%, which is one of the highest in Asia Pacific, to 25%, and it's going to move its way to 20%. And for the small and medium-sized companies, they pay 20% income tax today, which makes the Philippines one of the lowest tax regimes, especially for small to mid-sized companies in the world, not just in Asia. Okay? We have to appreciate that. And there's so much more tax reform that that we don't have time to share right now. Next is the reserve requirement, unleashing 2 trillion pesos of funds that were locked in the banks that are now made available for investment and for lending that was not there before. Liquidity needed at the time when COVID hit us. At the time when liquidity should be scarce, liquidity actually improved in the Philippines because of this policy. Infrastructure. Nobody built the number of roads and bridges and airports and seaports that this administration did in just under 5 years. And why? Because this administration had the political capital to make all these projects happen and to tell people who are harassing infrastructure projects to say, hey, do not slow down this project. Get out of my way. I'm building this road. I'm building this bridge. I'm building this airport, whether you like it or not, and you're not going to get in the way. And because of that political willpower, because of that political capital, a lot of infrastructure projects happened, started, and completed in this time. And you and I might not appreciate the full brunt of that because we have been restricted in traveling because of COVID protocols. But as soon as that economy fully opens and we are allowed to travel, the experience all over the Philippines will be dramatic. Just remember how it was like to travel from Alabang to Balintawak in 20 minutes. Never in our lifetime was that ever possible, but it was made possible because of this administration and because of San Miguel and because of other companies like them that do all these infrastructure projects all over the country. When you realize how many projects were completed in the last 24 months, and the next 24 months to be completed, it is hard not to be bullish about the Philippines. The REIT law, and some of you have been watching this REIT law and are investing in the stock market. The REIT law has been magic because since then, 7 REITs have been listed with another 9-10 in the pipeline, and it's releasing dramatic amounts of capital at fantastic valuations, at first world valuations of tier 2 assets of these developers in the Philippines. Okay? Try to appreciate that. The REIT companies have been able to raise tremendous amount of capital at fantastic yields, at fantastic valuations, at first world valuations in the Philippines. Okay? And they're not even injecting tier 1 assets. Just think about that. And because of that, you and I are now able to invest safely in real estate by enjoying capital appreciation and fantastic tax-free yields while having the benefits of owning stocks instead of real estate. And debt raising. The Philippines has been able to raise so much debt in the last 24 months. Now, that debt has been politicized heavily because people are saying, oh my God, the company is going to go bankrupt because of all this debt. Well, I'll put it in perspective, okay? Prior to COVID, the debt to GDP ratios of the Philippines was more or less 39-40%. And in the last 24 months, we had to bring that up to about 60%. Okay, we've almost doubled the amount. We've raised the amount of debt by about 50% in 24 months. And why did we have to do that? Because of COVID. Why? Just imagine you're a restaurant. You're a restaurant that is fully staffed, very expensive, most of it going to labor, some of it going to materials and hardware. Okay? And rule number one, you cannot fire anybody. Regardless of what happens, you have to pay salaries. You cannot fire anyone. Number two, all of a sudden, from enjoying 100% business and revenue every day, every hour of the day, every week, every month, every year, all of a sudden you go to zero. And yet, you have to pay all your suppliers. You do not have the option to pay all your suppliers, right? You keep paying your taxes, you keep paying your real estate taxes, your business permits, your salaries, your raw mats, even if you're not using them. You still pay all these other expenses related to a business, right? And yet you have zero revenue. And then all of a sudden the economy opens up again, then you go up to 10% revenue, 20% revenue, and then lockdown again. Open again, lockdown again. Do you know what that's going to do to a business? You will run out of money like anything. And that is what happened to the Philippine government and to the country, where, oh my God, there's no tax revenue because no ports are open, no income from the Bureau of Customs, no income from businesses and income tax because so many people got laid off. How is the government going to fund its operations and the infrastructure programs and the welfare programs and the healthcare programs and the vaccines, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? Well, the only way to do that is to borrow money. And that's what we've been able to do. And we were only able to do that because of the amazing fiscal health of this country managed by the Duterte administration under the helm of Secretary Dominguez. Okay, so when you see Secretary Dominguez, please go out of your way and say thank you, because unwittingly, you and I benefit from his effort and the effort of his economic team. Lastly is PEZA. PEZA has been a staunch defender of investors in the Philippines, and they stayed here, and Director General Plaza continued to assure investors that the Philippines is here for business, to look out for their interests, and to make sure that everything is well, despite all the hardship that COVID brought upon us. And now there's a new challenge, the Ukraine crisis, that is just pushing inflation and interest rates all throughout the country. It's going to hit the Philippines hard, and we have to brace ourselves for that. But be confident that this administration has been very conscious about managing the fiscal situation of this country for the benefit of everyone. Next. And that's why I show you the movement of office space. Why is the movement of office space important? Because it's a big driver of tax for the country. Number two, it is a barometer for employment. Companies will take office space because they employ people. And they hire a lot of people. They fuel construction all throughout the country. And a lot of indirect jobs are attached to this. That's why the importance of the office sector. And the yellow line shows you the total demand every year for the last 6 years. And in the last 6 years, the Philippines has been one of the largest markets in the world for office demand. New leasing. And that's what many people in the Philippines don't appreciate, that the Philippines is one of the largest, it is in the top 3 or 4 largest markets in the world after Shanghai, Beijing, Tokyo. It's the Philippines, and maybe Mumbai or Bangalore, one of those two. Okay, so these five, and we are in the top five. Okay, and we are the envy of so many countries around the world. How they wish they had a BPO sector to carry office demand despite the crisis. Now, why is the BPO sector so important? Because the BPO sector produces jobs in the Philippines despite a crisis. Every time the world goes into crisis, multinational companies say, oh my gosh, we're going through another period of crisis. Therefore, our revenues are going to be impacted. Therefore, our profits are going to be impacted. We need to cut costs. And the only way to cut costs without cutting productivity is to moving jobs out of expensive locations into places like the Philippines and India. And so the BPO industry has insulated us from every crisis that has hit the world. So much so that every time there is a crisis in the world, more jobs are created in the Philippines. And you see that in this line. Yes, in 2019 to 2020, you see a downward spike only because the world was trying to understand what COVID was about, how it's hitting businesses. And then you see this uptrend in 2021, and we see it going forward to 2022, 23, 24, 25. Why? Because now that companies are stabilizing, they're figuring out what to do and how much of the organization they will offshore to Philippines. And a testimony of that is this uptick in office leasing. The office leasing didn't go to zero, it didn't go to negative. It kept growing despite COVID. And this is a very important fact to remember. The POGO sector disappeared in 2020 and 2021, but they're going to keep coming back, I think, in 2022 onwards. Next. Another reason to be thankful is that office contraction has stopped. This yellow line is the movement of the amount of contractions companies did throughout the Philippines. And you can see that it peaked 1 year and 3 months ago in the fourth quarter of 2020. It peaked, and from that point, it stopped. It kept decelerating, which means that companies stopped contracting. Yes, there was an uptick in the fourth quarter of 2021, but we anticipate that in 2022 first quarter, that's going to be much, much lower. And that's predominantly because of the most recent lockdown and Omicron. 50% of all terminations came from the POGO sector. The BPO sector contracted very, very little. Next. And this shows you the supply and the demand of office space. And I'm asked all the time, when is the best time to build an office building? The answer to that is now. Build the office building now and finish in 2024 or 2025 when the supply is at its lowest. And by that time, there will be so much stability in the office market. A lot of the supply that's sitting vacant today will be wiped out. Next. The REITs have been fantastic because it's given us another vehicle to generate capital appreciation and dividends despite everything. And globally, REIT stocks have been very steady, especially during a crisis. Next. And the best testament to that is how the yields and capital value increases have happened and performed in the last 24 months, with the A-REIT launching at the peak of COVID. And yet, look at how A-REIT has performed. It has been amazing. Next. Capital values continue to climb, and this is just some of the land values all throughout the Philippines on a per square meter basis. Next. The residential market. Forbes Park is the most expensive place to live in the Philippines. The typical property there is 2,500 to 3,000 square meters, costing 1 billion pesos just for the land. If you were to build a new home today, you'll probably spend another 200 million easily just on the house. And so property values in Forbes, Dasma, Bel Air, everywhere continue to climb. And there's a myth that people propagate that says investing in condominiums is a waste of time. That is not true. More and more people will start living in condominium space because it is the most sensible thing to do. And second, it is the most environmental friendly. And third, it is a product of urbanization. Urbanization is the fact that people cluster through cities, and that is a global phenomenon. And it will keep happening, especially as the economy continues to grow. Next. There is a backlog of something like 15 million units for Philippines. Okay, 5 million in the homeless category, and another 10 million of people who need to upgrade from their home. As you know, the typical middle class in the Philippines comprises of a small property lived in by 3 generations: grandparents, their kids, and their kids' kids. And so much so that in a small property of maybe 100 square meters floor area, there's like 7 people, 12 people, 15 people living in this small area. And as economic progress happens, as the years come by, these people are able to afford more and more real estate, and they will start moving out of their grandparents' home to live independently. So there's a big pipeline of condominium space out there, but that is small compared to the backlog that is existing in the Philippines today. Next. And even throughout COVID crisis, the volume of transactions continued to climb. This is the volume of deals per price point. So from the lower middle all the way to the luxury and all these markets continue to climb after every lockdown. Next. And that is despite COVID. So even though you might hear that it seems like the end of the world during COVID, it's now the end of the world because of hyperinflation potentially caused by the Ukraine-Russian crisis. It is not the end of the world. I just want to assure you that it is not the end of the world, and it will keep flourishing. This slide shows you capital values in orange versus rental rates in blue. And capital values continue to hold despite an erosion in rental values. And mind you, in 2020, the economy, the GDP contracted by as much as 10%, one of the biggest contractions of any country in the world. And yet capital values continue to hold in most condominiums. And I am sharing with you information from 544 different buildings across almost 300,000 individual units. And this is just the reality. Yes, there are a few distressed transactions out there, a few distressed sellers that needed to sell right away, but those are few and far between. Predominantly, sellers are holding on to their price. Next. And this is how prices are in every city throughout the country, on average across the condominium market. The story is not just the Philippines, it's all over. It's not just about Manila, it is all over the Philippines. Next. I showed you, or I started this presentation by saying that you should use this pandemic as a way to invest in real estate because the capital appreciation of property has been slowed down and suppressed by COVID and this Russia-Ukraine crisis. And look at the compounded annual growth rates of a number of projects all across Metro Manila, across the 5 different largest developers in the country. The compounded annual growth rates over 5 years, 7 years, 10 years, 12 years, 20 years in some cases range anywhere from a low of 7 to a high of 20% per annum consistently across a number of years. Think about that. And again, it is not just about Metro Manila. Next. It is also happening all throughout the country. Next. Before I close, I want to say that as bullish as I may sound, I want to reaffirm that I am cautiously optimistic. Okay, in the sea of bad news, in the ocean of bad news, we are one of the few people in this market telling others the good things that's happening to this country despite all the bad things happening in this country. Okay? I do not have any political color. Okay? I do not favor anybody. I just share the facts. And the facts are we owe a lot to this administration as much as we do, or maybe even more, than the achievements of the previous administrations. Okay? That is fact. Number two, believe in the Philippines, because there are many fundamental things going really well and good things, fundamentally good things happening to the Philippines that will just benefit the generations to follow. Number three, I am told that many of you in the audience are young people. I have to say there is benefit and merit in loyalty, benefit and merit in honesty, benefit and merit in hard work, and having a mindset of excellence that you apply to your work. So save up, look long term, and save up and invest wisely. And with that, thank you very much for your time and attention and for having me speak to you today.
InvestaFest 2022 is brought to you by these major partners: ATRAM, 2Trade Asia, and these other partners. Do not forget to share your experience and learning on social media. Use our official hashtag InvestaFest 2022.